Welcome back to the Morn Moan Grave yet again, my friends. And today, we have a very wild and wacky one for you, dude. So, without further ado, strap in and make like the Morn Grave tree as you all join me for part 3. Oh hey dude, how nice of you guys to join me yet again for part 3 of the DLC weapon type frame data analysis. So, with that being said, we are going to dive right in to this next weapon type, weapon class. So, this one is very, very weird and extremely odd because not only the baselines of how the weapon actually functions, as we'll see here in a minute, but also because this is probably the most unfinished frame data set of the 5 that we have access to right now. So when it comes to kind of dissecting and breaking down this weapon class, whatever it shapes up being, I would definitely take the vast majority of this stuff with a grain of salt, especially the certain frame data sets for certain attacks tied to this weapon type. So there's certain attacks on it that just don't have like the recoveries associated with that particular attack, etc., right? So with that being said up front, let's take a look at it. So we have a neutral one-handed R1, the first one in the chain here, and we see that it has 6 projectiles tied to its neutral R1 attack, okay? So this kind of led a lot of folks, and me as well, to kind of make the connection to this in the gameplay reveal trailer that we see, right? We see a multi-shot crossbow of sorts happening here, right? And it would be very, very fascinating if this was the case, because obviously we're seeing a lot of projectiles being fired right here in this particular clip, right? Which I would imagine this is probably this weapon type's Ash of War, or this specific crossbow's Ash of War that we're seeing there, because it fires like over 20 shots, as we see just in this small clip here, you know? So that's very interesting, and this obviously being the kind of root and foundation for speculation as to what this weapon type maybe is. But honestly, the speculation can just run wild with whatever this weapon type shapes up to be, because if it's not this crossbow or something like it, where they took like a purely ranged type weapon and gave it a full moveset with running attacks, rolling attacks, running R2 attacks, etc., jumping attacks, right? It's very interesting. So that's kind of where my mind's at as to the speculation on this weapon this weapon type in general, right? But genuinely it could be anything. So I have no idea. I'm kind of tossing my hands up in the air right now, right? But so with that being said, once again, we have a frame 14 bullet that the first bullet comes out at, and then we have the next frame on frame 15, we have the second projectile coming out, and then we have a 1 frame break on frame 16, and then after that, we have another projectile fired on frame 17, and then another 1 frame break, and then 19, 20, and 21, right? So this is a 6 projectile single input that you can just throw on out there, dude. You know, we always thought the repeating crossbow and the Avalon from the previous games that From Software has made in the Dark Souls series, for example, was crazy with just a triple shot crossbow, and obviously we have the repeating crossbow already in Elden Ring. But what's very interesting is that the crossbows, they've never had like a full moveset associated with them, right? If that's indeed what we're looking at here, it's very, very fascinating because as we pull up the rest of the R1s in this R1 chain here, we can see a little bit of a difference in variance, right? So we have these one frame breaks in between shot 2 and shot 3, and shot 3 and shot 4, right? And then we have the subsequent R1 in the one-handed R1 chain. It's just bullets coming out every subsequent frame, right? So after frame 14, frame 15, frame 16, 17, 18, and 19 respectively. And every single R1 press, once again, is firing 6 separate projectiles. And that is just absolutely wild. So I'm not quite too sure what to make of this at this point, but so that's going over the baseline R1 chain, right? And as I stated earlier, there's certain attacks that don't have the respective recoveries associated with them, right? So the attacks that don't have the associated frame data attached to them, I would kind of take these with a grain of salt, but we'll still look at them anyway just to get a little bit of a better idea, right? So this would be the one-handed running R1, for example, would come out, the first projectile would come out on frame 18, 1 frame break, frame 20, 1 frame break, frame 22, right? So that's fascinating. And then probably the single most egregious attack, if From Software decides to continue with this down this design path, is this. Okay, so we have the one-handed running R2, we have a frame 4 first projectile activation that shoots out. On frame 4, 1 frame break, and that's a recurring theme in between here. We see this 1 frame break all the way up until the end where it ends up firing 2. But we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that is, as it stands currently in the frame data, once again, like I said, I would take these with a grain of salt because they don't have the respective recoveries attached to them. But it just kind of puts it into perspective. It's like, what is From Software doing with this weapon type, dude? You know, so that's extremely interesting, dude. We have a running R2 that shoots 12 projectiles, so definitely look out for that. Okay, so moving on from that, we do have, and once again, you know, just not having the recoveries tied to the rolling attack and or crouching attacks respectively here. So but we have a frame 13 projectile, the first one coming out on frame 13, and then once again this 1 frame break kind of situation. It's a repetitive theme all throughout, right? And once again we have what, 7 shots here on the rolling and crouching R1, which is just, I'm at a loss for words for this weapon at a certain point, dude. So, then we have the backstep R1s, which once again, this kind of points towards very, very unfinished, right? So that's interesting. And then we have actually the fully charged R2 attack here, and we'll pull up the R2 release as well outside of the fully charged. So obviously fully charged is going to this entire, you know, charged animation, etc., and then the release to uncharged. So it's going to be about what, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to frame 8. So a frame 8 release window on the first projectile coming out, and then once again you see that frame gap here, which is really, really interesting. So the R2 fires. Oh, that's interesting actually. I didn't see this. So the uncharged release only shoots 4 projectiles here, and the fully charged actually shoots 5. So that's a fascinating discrepancy there. I didn't catch that last time I was looking through. So always catching something new going back through, dude. That's good stuff. All right, so looked at that, the backstep R1s respectively, and then we have the R2-2, so the follow-up R2 in the chain. So like it's weird, dude. They actually have full moveset construction with the way that this is functioning. So, and we actually don't see a discrepancy here between the fully charged variant of the follow-up R2 in the one-handed chain and the uncharged. So both of those are shooting 5 projectiles respectively. So that's interesting as well too. And then this is weird as hell too. We have a guard counter associated with presumably what seems to be a purely ranged weapon, which is fascinating too, because if you think back to the pure throwing dagger frame data, they also had guard counters associated with them as well, right? So you're kind of seeing this interesting theme with the first 2 videos that I made, right, where we had the R2s of the weapon class having projectiles tied to it and all of its augmented R2 attacks, and then you have the purely throwing dagger weapons, which have projectiles just on every single attack, period. So it really seems that From Software likes the idea of just a purely ranged weapon that has a full moveset associated with it. And I think that's really cool that they're trying to kind of take that ranged playstyle to a whole nother level and make it actually have depth and nuance to it, instead of just, oh, I'm pressing R1 over and over and over again, right? And you see that kind of with their evolution throughout the games, with especially Dark Souls 3, right? That's when they started implementing like rolling attacks for bows, for example, and sprinting attacks as well. And then they took that even further in Elden Ring. They kind of cleaned up those animations and still retained those, but they also added, you know, like crouching attacks and jumping attacks respectively. Like being able to do jump shots with the bows and crossbows is really cool, right? But they still didn't have their own full moveset. It was kind of just those augmented sprint-based attacks or movement-based attacks, right? And now, obviously, as we've seen in part 1, part 2, and now part 3, they're really, really diving into trying to explore full moveset ranged weapons, which I think is awesome. And I really hope they take that and expound upon that for spells too, more so. Like the way that Carrion Slicer functions, for example, and Catch Flame, right? To give you an incantation example as well as a sorcery one, you know, like that's what makes Carrion Slicer and Catch Flame so fun to use as magic, right? Is just they have way more nuance and depth to them because you can use all of those augmented movement-based discrepancies, you know, within your attack set, right? And granted, once again, you know, like Catch Flame and Slicer, they don't have full movesets per se, but they were going down that kind of same route and same path with those designs. So I really hope we see more of that design in terms of incantation and sorceries too, going into the DLC. But slight tangent, I do apologize for that, but we're getting back into it here. So yeah, we have the guard counter associated with a purely ranged weapon, once again, which is extremely odd. And then we also have the jumping attacks, which this is interesting, right? So we actually see the jumping attacks being relatively done, you know, like in comparison to like the running attacks, for example, right? They don't have any recovery associated with them or anything like that. Even the rolling attacks, for example, right? So the jumping attacks definitely got a lot more work put into them at this point in development whenever we, you know, whenever these were uploaded in patch 1.7, right? They definitely got further with certain pieces of the kit, right? As opposed to others. And the jumping attack is one that you would expect them not to have, you know, the appropriate recoveries attached to, but here we're seeing that they most certainly do. So that aside, we have frame 14 first shot, which seems to be kind of like the standard with this weapon. The first projectile releasing on frame 14. So by no means is this weapon going to be like unreactable or anything like that, right? Which definitely is good. And if it is a crossbow, that's even better, because you don't want like unreactable sleep bolts or things of that nature too, with all the status based bolts and stuff that you can tie into the crossbows and stuff. So that's definitely fascinating there. It seems to be a pretty damn good jumping attack too, because the dodge recovery isn't that bad. It's only 7 frames from the end of the last shot. So that's definitely fascinating as well. And then obviously we have the light attack cancel here to immediately go into the neutral R1 attack immediately afterward, right? So you can go into this attack 1 frame after the last bullet activates, but then you would need to sit through the startup frames of the one-handed R1, right? But the way that this thing is designed is shaping up to be extremely weird and extremely potentially oppressive, right? In the right hands. Could be very annoying to fight. So yeah, we have that, and then we have the jumping R2 here, which also has associated frame data once again, just way heavier recovery, right? So that's what, 17 frames until you get to the dodge recovery, and the light attack cancel is locked to being the same as the dodge recovery cancel, which is interesting, as we saw the one-handed jumping R1 earlier having a significantly faster light attack only cancel, right? So definitely interesting there. But moving on from that, we also do see that whatever this weapon is, it has a riposte animation and a backstab animation tied to it as well. Just like we saw with the purely thrown throwing daggers, right? So this weapon, this purely projectile-based weapon having the ability to backstab and riposte is extremely weird, too. It made a little bit more sense for the purely thrown throwing daggers, like we discussed in part 1, but if this is like a crossbow, you know what I mean? Like we were theorizing earlier, it's like, how in the hell does that work, dude? So that's definitely extremely weird. I don't know what's going on with this thing, but moving on after that too, we kind of get into the two-handed moveset here, okay? So as we saw earlier, the one-handed R1s, they fire off 6 projectiles in each one of its respective chains, right? Each. And the two-handed, if you thought 6 was a lot, here we see that we have 10. And the structure is quite different here as well. We actually see 2 projectiles being shot out on each individual frame here. So frame 14 is when the first little bit of projectiles are shot out, and then we don't see that 1 frame gap like we were seeing, you know, as kind of like a reoccurring theme beforehand. We're actually seeing every single frame firing 2. And that kind of more closely aligns, honestly, with what we're seeing in this shot with this crossbow, because we're seeing, if this is like the Ash of War that's like potentially locked to this weapon in particular, that might have a unique one that we're seeing right here. This is very interesting too, because it's very similar to that, right? Like you're seeing so many projectiles, and it's just egregious. And the same can very much be said about R1 number 1 of the two-handed R1 chain. So yeah, once again, 2 projectiles each frame, all the way up from starting on frame 14 and completing on frame 18. And this is very fast. This 4-frame window here to shoot like 10 projectiles, that's absolutely wild. But one thing I did want to point out here, as egregious as this seems, right, and it definitely is, it's ridiculous, we do have a very, very significant dodge recovery here. So ending on frame 19 there, all the way to frame 32. So that is a very, very significant dodge recovery. That's 12 frames. So even though you're firing this many projectiles, and it is extremely oppressive potentially, you know, in a PvP setting, you're going to be able to punish, especially, and this is something that I talked about with a couple of my buddies when we were analyzing this frame data too, is that potentially this weapon type, if it is the crossbow or whatever it shapes up to be, I think that it's going to have very poor tracking, because like if you see here, it looks like this player's kind of like rooted in place while doing this, and maybe you're locked into doing the reload animation after each shot too, or something like that, right? Those would be two very, very clever ways of balancing a weapon type like this, right? Is making them have very poor tracking and forcing you to do kind of like the reload animation afterward, instead of being able to choose to do it whenever you want, like safely with like a traditional crossbow, for example, right? And how that functionality actually shapes up to be. But so definitely keep that in mind as we're going through this too. But so yeah, that's the two-handed neutral R1, just absolutely mind-blowing. And then we see the second R1 in the chain. Once again, 10 more projectiles there. Very, very interesting, but we do actually see that kind of one frame break cropping up here again to kind of balance this out. You know, we see a little bit of delayed spurts there, dude, for lack of a better terminology, dude. So then into R1 number 3 in the chain, we see it very, very similarly in setup to the R11. It's just it comes out on frame 18 as opposed to frame 14 and finishes on frame 22 as opposed to frame 19 respectively there. So, and then we have the chain finisher here, which mimics the exact same functionality as R12 in the chain, just a little bit later once again. So that's definitely interesting, right? So you have, so like, let's tally up how many that is that's 40 shots, dude, in just the full two-handed R1 chain. See, and this is actually a good time to bring this up too, because if this is the crossbow that we're seeing in the trailer and it has this full moveset associated with it, you know, in functionality, then that potentially means that, you know, you would have to use crossbow bolts with this too, right? But being that we just conveyed that a single R1 chain, R11 through R14, is going to take 40 bolts, that doesn't really make much sense, you know what I mean? Like, you're gonna be able to just do two full R1 chains two-handed, and then you only have 20 bolts left, dude? Like, I don't know how they're, like, if it's going to require a reagent, like, you know, bolts, for example, or, once again, if this weapon type, whatever it is going to have infinite ammo, effectively, just like what we were seeing from the pure throwing dagger weapons, right? Because, like, 100%, that's not going to have any limit on it. Just the same as in part 2, where we discussed the augmented R2 projectile-based attack weapon type, that's not going to have any ammunition tied to it either. So, I mean, from what I would assume, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to superimpose that limitation upon those, right? So maybe, and I'm just thinking of this on the spot, maybe these weapon types require, like, FP to throw for their base attacks. I don't know, but it points towards these purely ranged weapon types, except for excluding, you know, the chakrams and or reverse grip curve swords, but those projectiles on the R2s, I don't know if there's going to be any limitation as to how much you can actually use those projectiles, because once again, harkening back to the base game with the Wing of Estelle weapon and the R2 projectiles that it has alongside the Frozen Needle R2s, both of those weapons having infinite, you know, usage of those projectiles. They don't cost a reagent or anything like that, right? And they don't cost FP either. So that all points towards these 3 weapon types for these specific attacks that have projectiles tied to them. It really seems that they're free of charge. Obviously, this weapon type definitely is the one that is most egregious in that regard. If it doesn't cost anything and you can just fire this off as much as you want, it's hard to say, dude. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments as to how the functionality and like what this could potentially take in terms of a reagent, or whether it's going to cost FP, whether it's going to cost bolts, etc., right? So moving on from that, though, the neutral moveset here, see this and once again, take these attacks without recovery associated with them with a grain of salt. We have the two-handed running R2 attack here. It has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28 projectiles tied to this singular attack. Like that to me, that kind of reinforces the whole idea that if this is gonna cost bolts, dude, you're just gonna run out immediately. But once again, maybe that's a good thing, to kind of keep this weapon type in check, if that is the case. If it's, you know, like bolt associated, you know, it has that resource that they need to kind of manage, right? You're gonna be like opening up your inventory, using every single one of your bolts that you have, like just swapping them out, dude, back and forth if you main this thing. Like that would be hilarious if you had to micromanage it like that. So yeah, there's the very interesting running R2 attack there with the two-handed. And once again, I believe we don't even see, so yeah, and like the frame data is all like out of whack too, dude. Like it's not organized in the way that it should be, because like if you go back to this, you see the running R1 and the running R2 rolling, etc., right? The one-handed moveset is kind of very organized in the way that it should be, as opposed to like every other weapon type in the game. It kind of follows this identical pattern here. And then with the two-handed moveset, right, you start seeing like, where's the running R1, where's the crouching R1 frame data, you know what I mean? And it's like the running R1 frame data is here. See, and this is kind of where we come to a close with the frame data, unfortunately, because they just don't. They have all of this. Oh, okay. I didn't see this before. That's fascinating. Okay, so it actually does have offhand and power stanced. The paired moveset associated with it, dude. Is the dual Avalon back, dude? Power stanced Avalons from DS2, bro. Holy shit. Okay, but once again, take all of this with a grain of salt, because it's in here. It doesn't mean that they were necessarily going to add it, but the fact that it is in here is very, very interesting. And they have the paired running attacks associated with it too, so Wow, dude. Yeah, this... Whatever this weapon type shapes up to be in the DLC, or if they didn't just scrap it altogether, the idea, which is always a possibility, right? That they could have just decided against something like this. But if this thing does make it in some capacity to the DLC, even if it's like a largely altered state from what we're seeing, like frame data wise, you know, from the stuff that is relatively closer to being finalized and finished, even if it deviates massively from that, once again, having another purely projectile based weapon type, I think is a really cool thing. And regardless of what we end up getting, I think if they stick to that core baseline and basis, I think that it's going to be really interesting no matter what. I definitely have faith in From to create some wild and wacky stuff, dude. But that kind of rounds out the third video here, I do believe. Yeah, because like all of this is completely just unfinished. It doesn't have like the active attack frames or anything like that associated with it. So all right, my friends, so thank you guys for joining me for part 3 of the DLC weapon frame data analysis, dude. And I hope you'll join me yet again for the next one. Bye for now, everyone.